Good morning, everybody. Thanks for taking your time out of your busy day to join us. Today we're going to be looking at Cyber Essentials Plus and an IT manager's take on it. Just a bit of background, I am the Technical Services Manager at Sapphire, but I'm also the IT Manager at Sapphire. And over the last 3 years, we've successfully passed Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus. So with our special insight into the world of security, we're going to break down the Cyber Essentials Plus standard and look at the practical technical methods and tools that we use to make that Cyber Essentials Plus audit go that much smoother and hopefully give a better chance of passing it first time and continue with certifications. So, if any are on the call here that know Sapphire, you might be aware that we are also a certifying body to Cyber Essentials Plus. So you might think that's pretty easy for us if we can use our internal auditors to do it for us. But unfortunately, we're not allowed to mark our own homework. So we too, like any of you guys, do have an independent auditor come in. So we do have to address this and carry it forward in a proper manner. So let's jump through the presentation now, and first things we're going to have a look at is the 5 technical controls of Cyber Essentials Plus. So that's basically it. Although the audit, when the auditor comes in, is very rigorous, it's quite narrow in its width. The first 3 we're going to cover quite quickly because, as we'll see, it's something that most enterprise organizations will be doing to some extent. The last 2 can be the major challenge, and that's where we'll go into a bit more detail with a case study on how we have used processes and tools with regard to vulnerability management to help us pass the Cyber Essentials Plus. So jumping into the first technical control of secure configuration, the objective is mainly around properly configured devices and password management. So this is something that is covered by deployment policies and centralized management. So in essence, it's something that we can control at a single point, and it's probably something that we're all doing anyway. So have you changed default passwords on devices? Do you have a good AD policy, and is it enforced? Those type of things. So something that we're all pretty used to in enterprise organizations, and something that we'll be probably doing at a good level now. User access control is all about how users access the system basically with the least privilege. So it's again something that we would implement and manage centrally. So not allowing your users to have access to their endpoint with full administration rights, as an example. And also having those policies and procedures in place with regard to adding users to your system, removing users from those systems, and policies and procedures around moving those users and accounts. So again, something that as an enterprise organization, we're probably doing at a good high level at this moment in time. Malware protection. This can be broken down into 2 sections. First one being the endpoint, and this is all about malware protection at the endpoint. So there are a few methods to achieve this. You can use application whitelisting or sandboxing, but it's probably fair to say that most of us deal this with antivirus software out there. So again, it's probably as an enterprise something that we're doing centrally. Having an enterprise software solution and centrally manage that. So what we're after here is to ensure that all endpoints have antivirus, and those definitions that antivirus are using are updated at the very least on a daily basis. So again, something that is not rocket science out there for the enterprise organizations. But malware protection is also on the gateway. So it's important at the gateway, and no doubt again implemented within enterprise organizations. So this is looking for mail filters with antivirus protection, recommended that's a different supply to the endpoint, and also web proxying, so your web traffic is filtered. So when the auditor comes in on site, he will check if malware or executables can be downloaded from the internet and ran on an endpoint via a mail route or a web route. So having, again, a centralized mail and web filtering can assist at a central point, and therefore it's easily managed with a certain set of rules for all your staff. So you know that mail and web filtering is being deployed across your organization in a constant manner. Okay, so we'll start getting into a bit more of the fun bits. Firewalls can be sort of broken down into two part of it, objectives. So first is just basic good firewall management, like changing default passwords, preventing access to the admin console, and decent rule configs. Again, any enterprise solution, there shouldn't be anything that we're not unfamiliar with, and basically being able to manage that firewall in a good way. However, there is the exposure of your firewall to the internet and managing the possible vulnerabilities from your external point of view. So, for example, when did you last have a penetration test? Do you know what your exposure is from the outside? We'll address this in a bit more detail when we get into vulnerability management. Last control is patch management. So the objective, ensure that devices and software are not vulnerable to known security issues for which fixes are available. Okay, it's a fairly simple sentence for the objective, but this is where we found, in our personal experience, where the most work is needed. So not only identify what needs to be done, but how to remediate those issues. Previously, we've seen that all the other controls generally can be implemented from a single point within your organization. Firewalls, Active Directory, mail web gateways, so forth. So one change affects all of the network and all your staff. However, here we need to address every endpoint individually, which is fairly simple in a network of 10, 20 devices. But what happens if your network, we're talking about hundreds or even thousands? So this is where vulnerability management comes in, and a program around that we've had a fairly mature one for a long time, and we found it invaluable, if not downright essential, to address this control. So let's jump into vulnerability management and see about implementations. So first thing I'd just like to address is the difference between vulnerability assessment and vulnerability management. Vulnerability assessment is the collection of vulnerability data. And it can be said, without foresight or an end goal, why collect the data? Penetration test is a good example of vulnerability assessment. It assesses your status and vulnerability, but if you're not acting on that data, almost why are you collecting it? So a well thought out vulnerability program ensures that data that we have collected with other processes that could be manual or tools ensure complete visibility, remediation, verification, and discovery in a continuous cycle on vulnerability management. So vulnerability management is a program where vulnerability assessment is just the data. So graphically, we can demonstrate this with vulnerability assessment is discover and assess. But when we're talking about a vulnerability management program, we're talking about discovering, assessing, remediation of those vulnerabilities, the verification of those vulnerabilities have been remediated, and loop back to the discover part of it. So it's a continuous process that goes round and round that helps you mitigate those vulnerabilities within a program. So some companies out there believe, that if you buy a vulnerability management tool, that's the magic bullet for you. However, one of our vendors who has analyzed those companies that are using their vulnerability management tool actually found that only 5% of those enterprises are displaying a mature vulnerability management program. Let's define maturity. Maturity is split into 3 sections. How often you scan. There is no point doing it once every 6 months. Making sure that you gather as much information for every machine that out there that you're looking for. So that's, in technical terms, an authentication scan, opposed to a port scan. And also your asset coverage, ensuring that all assets are discovered and scanned. There is no point in scanning 50% of your network. It's not going to give you the information. So what we found is that only 5% are following that mature program. And actually 33%, a third of the people out there that have invested in the tool, are actually a very low maturity style. So what this is trying to demonstrate here is a tool is not a magic bullet and a fix all. You have to integrate that within a program to be able to get the most out of it. So for those customers that have gone out and bought vulnerability management tools, what are their challenges? Why are they finding it difficult to have a mature program? Well, it can be broken down into identification and confidence, and that's knowing your tool and how to use it. And we found ourselves and a lot of our customers, the prioritization is a big thing. If you first put a vulnerability management tool into your network, and it reports hundreds, if not thousands, of vulnerabilities out there, how do you start that? You know, how do you see the wood for the trees? It can be a daunting task to look at. And also around resources and skills, you know, do you have the time and the people to be able to assign to this vulnerability management program? And do they have the correct skills? Are they understanding what's coming back? The last two, generally we're finding in the market that, you know, outsourcing the vulnerability management program can be a way of addressing the resources and skills. So let's jump into a case study, how we at Sapphire have implemented our vulnerability management program and how we manage this moving forward that helps us with our Cyber Essentials Plus certifications. Okay, we're not untypical in our network setup. We have a head office that would have our main ingress firewall, servers, desktop machines, those static type machines. We have a few remote officers, laptop users been in there working away, and we also got those remote workers, either those road warriors or home workers within our network. So when we look at the discover part of a vulnerability management program, how do I know that I'm going to discover everything that's in my network? Well, as we talked about previously in our firewall, the first thing I really need to do is scan back from the cloud back into my organization to make sure I've got no vulnerabilities on my network based on my exposure to the internet. So a cloud scanner here, being able to scan back to my IP addresses that I'm exposing to the internet, gives me confidence that I know I have no vulnerabilities on the external network. I can drop scanners into our network in our head office, and these are great to be able to reach out to those static machines, those servers, those desktops, those firewalls, those mail gateways, those ones that don't move. We know where they are, but generally on 24 hours a day. We also actually have a scanner in our DMZ to be able to scan our exposure in our DMZ part of our firewall. The next part of it, these people who are mobile on the laptops can be a challenge, but what we do is we drop agents on those machines that allows us, as a part of our build process, to know that every laptop, every agile worker, every mobile device out there is also being scanned for vulnerabilities and all fed into a single pane of glass. So we know if we have a hybrid approach of cloud, on-prem and agent scanners, I know that I'm covering my whole network. I have no black holes. I'm covering everything and I'm getting all the information that I need. So once we've done the discovery part of the vulnerability management program, we can now assess this. So we now have those vulnerabilities feeding back to a single pane of glass where we can consume that data. And we have options within this tool to be able to consume this data in various ways that helps us assess where we are with our vulnerabilities. So, for example, we can consume this data by vulnerability. So let's say we've got 31 critical vulnerabilities, but actually 25 of them are an out-of-date Chrome browser. So we know that if we address our Chrome browser vulnerability within our network, we're making a big impact into our critical vulnerabilities. So we can consume that by understanding what critical and high vulnerabilities we have out there. Are they the same vulnerability on multiple machines, and therefore look at assessing and planning to address those by vulnerabilities? Or we can consume this data in an asset. I don't know, let's say the financial director is popping into a 2-hour meeting and he can drop his laptop off to the IT guys. That means we can consume the vulnerability data by that asset and understand what vulnerabilities are on that asset and address them all within a time. And as you can imagine, these type of tools have other ways of being able to consume this data to help us plan our remediation moving forward, assess what's on our network and plan going forward. So once we have that information in and we've assessed the data, we need to push out remediation. Look, this is all about your patching policy. Pretty certain all our enterprise guys out there would have a patching policy, whether you accept the risk and push them out immediately or you pre-test those patches and roll them out across the network. Again, from our experience and what we see from our customers, generally Microsoft is a given. You'll be using WSOS or SCCM. Most of the companies out there, us included, had Microsoft sort of buttoned down and we knew what we were doing. Where we found our pain points were with third-party patching, so your Adobe's, your Java, your Flash, your non-standard browsers, etc. All the other software, and we've seen from the standard, it's any software that has critical patches, they need to be addressed as well. So again, you can consider tools, and we use a tool that is a centralized patching tool. Now that allows us, from our previous phase of assessing and consuming that data in either vulnerability or asset sense, being able to use tools to be able to address those and push those vulnerabilities out from a centralized point. So we're collecting our vulnerability data, we're analyzing that from a centralized point, and then we're pushing those patches out from a centralized point. So once we've actually done the remediation, we need to verify that that remediation is actually working. So why do we do this? Well, a couple of points here is we want to make sure that we're making an impact into our network, that we're driving those graphs in a downward way. We're making an impact from our planned assessment and our remediation. However, also, technically, sometimes you do need to verify that you've done it. The classic example is you might have identified a critical patch on a server and you push that critical patch out. And when we verify from a vulnerability management point of view, we find out that we're still vulnerable. Why would that be, even though the patching tool says that it's pushed it out? Well, it could be as simple as the server needs a reboot to apply that patch. So we have to be careful on the verification is to make sure that we're actually doing what we said we're doing, and we're verifying that those remediations have worked. And also, as a part of that verification, we loop back up to the discovery sense. So unfortunately, this is a continuous process, and this process, although we will fix some vulnerabilities, by the time we fix them, new vulnerabilities will be discovered. They are added on a daily basis, as you're well aware. So what we found is here that little and often is far better approach than a big bang approach. So keeping on top of the vulnerability management program of the discover, assess, remediate, verify, and loop back to the discover, little and often gives us a far better fighting chance to address the vulnerabilities within our network, opposed to leaving them for a long period of time and trying to address them in a big bang approach. So just in summary, with regard to Cyber Essentials, some parts of the Cyber Essentials we've seen, you probably already do and do very well with regard to centralized management, password policies, Active Directory policies and procedures. Some parts of Cyber Essentials Plus, you probably already have the tools and processes in place. Just make sure they are correct and used correctly and used in a consistent manner. But what we found is, in a network of any significant number, how do you identify vulnerabilities in your network? And consider using vulnerability management rolled into a program for any significant number of endpoints. Have that patching plan, and don't forget that it's just not Microsoft, it's all the software out there. Don't be caught that your SCCM or your WSUS is green across the board and you think you're okay. What about the Flash? What about the Adobes? It's addressing those, understanding those vulnerabilities in your network, and being able to plan the remediation in a sensible way. That basically concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your time. If there's any questions, I can open them up to anybody if you've got any.